Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
My name is Paul Diduch. I'm a faculty member here at CU in the Hurlburt program for Engineering, Ethics, and Society. I'm also the Director of Engineering Leadership. I'll be your moderator this afternoon. Thank you so much for coming. I'll go over the questions process shortly. Let me start, for recording purposes, say that today is Wednesday, April 9th, 2025. You guys know this. It is 3:30 p.m. and this is panel number 18168. Title of this panel, Who is Really in Charge? A conversation on checks and balances of power, in some sense, the constitutional theory of the United States. Before we get started, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty in their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. One other thing I'd like to mention is that we want to be sure you, the audience, gets a chance to ask questions. Here's how we'll handle the Q&A. We'll reserve the end of the discussion for the question period. We're using a note card system to receive questions from the audience. At any time in the session, simply raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers. Please write legibly, although I grade my students' work. I'm pretty good at deciphering handwriting, but please write legibly. If you are a student, please note this in your question on the card. When you finish, raise your hand to the producer and they'll bring it up to me. Again, I stress, if you have a burning question and you want me to see it and to insert it into the conversation, don't wait. Act on it. All right, I'm going to move to the bios. We have first Lisa Graves. Lisa Graves is a researcher, writer, and speaker. She is the managing director of Court Accountability and the director of its research arm, True North Research, which she founded. Lisa previously served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General at the U.S. Department of Justice's Office of Legal Policy and Policy Development. She was the Chief Counsel for Nominations on the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee and was the Deputy Chief of the Article III Judges Division for the U.S. Courts, among other posts. Lisa has appeared on most mainstream news programs, including MSNBC, CNN, NBC, and Democracy Now!, and her research and analysis has made its way to several prominent press outlets, including the New York Times, The Guardian, Washington Post, and many other papers and journals. Lisa was featured in the Ava DuVernay's film The 13th, which won 4 Emmy Awards and was nominated for an Oscar for Best Documentary. You should check that out. She also appeared in Showtime's Years of Living Dangerously with America Ferrera. Stephen F. Hayward is a fellow of the Public Law and Policy Program at UC Berkeley's School of Law. He is also the Gaylord Distinguished Visiting Professor at Pepperdine University's School of Public Policy and was the inaugural visiting scholar in conservative thought and policy here at CU Boulder in 2013 to 14. From 2002 to 12, he was the F.K. Weyerhaeuser Fellow in Law and Economics at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., and has been Senior Fellow at the Pacific Research Institute in San Francisco since 1991. He writes frequently for several publications, including the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, and Claremont Review of Books. Hayward is the author of 10 books, an impressive 10, including a 2-volume chronicle of Ronald Reagan and his times titled The Age of Reagan. His most recent book is M. Stanton Evans, Conservative Wit, Apostle of Freedom. Hayward writes daily on PowerlineBlog.com, one of the nation's most read political websites. We have Heather Hurlburt. Heather Hurlburt is an associate fellow at Chatham House, focusing on bridging the gap between U.S. politics and international affairs. From 2022 to 24, she served as Chief of Staff to U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai, overseeing strategy for President Joe Biden's worker-centered trade policy. Previously, she led the New Models of Policy Change project at New America, examining the intersection of international policy and U.S. political polarization on issues like trade, climate, and nuclear security. Hurlburt has held senior roles at the International Crisis Group and Human Rights First, and served as a speechwriter for Secretaries of State Madeleine Albright and Warren Christopher and President Bill Clinton, a co-founder of the Leadership Council for Women in National Security. She also serves on the U.S. Secretary of State's International Security Advisory Board. She holds degrees from Brown and George Washington Universities. Ellen Weintraub has served as a commissioner on the U.S. Federal Election Commission since 2002 and was elected chair for 25. During her tenure, she made her mark as a strong advocate for meaningful campaign finance law enforcement, robust disclosure, and combating foreign influence in our elections. She has been a critic of the system that gives disproportionate influence to billionaire donors and was a persistent voice, right, we know of a few of those, in 2020, refuting unfounded claims of voter fraud. On February 6, 2025, she received a letter from the president stating that he was removing her from her position on the commission. Weintraub has published articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and leading law reviews, and is a frequent speaker on news shows and at conferences at home and abroad. Prior to her appointment to the FEC, she was of counsel to the political law group of Perkins Coie LLP and counsel to the House Ethics Committee. She holds degrees from Yale College and Harvard Law School. Please welcome our panelists this afternoon. All right, I'm going to kick this off by inviting our panelists in the order of introduction to present their opening remarks. So we'll start with Lisa.
Oh my goodness. I was hoping to go after Steve. We'll get plenty of time, don't worry. I know. I was going to say, Steve, I've got to read your M. Stanton Evans book. I look forward to reading it.
Did you know him?
Yeah, I know of him. So anyway, it's an honor to be on this panel. It's a great pleasure to be here at CWA, and it's so wonderful to see so many of you who come every conference to really support this and help support your communities. Checks and balances. So, you know, I have serious thoughts about checks and balances. I have one sort of unserious thought about checks and balances based on the amazing creativity from the protests this past weekend. Someone had a sign that said, "They're eating the checks, They're eating the balances. And I thought that seemed actually accurate, unlike the original version of that quote. And I do think, I think that they are eating the checks and they are eating the balances. And it is quite extraordinary to live in this time, in the year 2025, and see the assault on the rule of law on a daily and some days hourly basis. It's been a really long 75 days. I feel like in dog years it might be like 7 months of my life. I'm not sure. I have rules in my house. My sweet husband has agreed to only wear headphones during the day while he's listening to the news because I'm working and I don't want to be distracted by what is the most random next assault that occurs at 11 and then again at 2. So I can read the news. You know, I consume it in sort of written form rather than live as it happens. It helps keep me reasonably sane, I would say. I think I remain sane despite these crazy times we live in. But to be really serious about this, I think we're facing the greatest test of our Constitution and our constitutional democracy, our democratic republic, that the nation has ever faced, because we have a president whose election was in part paved by a Supreme Court that has become unmoored from the rule of law. To have the Supreme Court intervene in the criminal prosecution of Trump that was underway in Washington, D.C. for well-pleaded crimes in the indictment, the crimes that he was indicted for, to have the U.S. Supreme Court weigh in, not just to delay that trial, perhaps till after the election, which was what some people thought was going to happen, but to actually have the Chief Justice of the United States, as the New York Times detailed, orchestrating an effort to insert into our Constitution that a president is above the law, that when a president is engaged in official acts, that he or she, but in this case he, cannot be held criminally liable for those actions. And then to have that person come into power basically with people in the sort of headline news hearing, oh, maybe that was a politicized prosecution, maybe there wasn't a basis for prosecuting him, when there was absolutely tremendous evidence supporting that prosecution and the other prosecutions. So then he comes into this position of power where he takes an oath on January 20th, administered by the Chief Justice, attesting, swearing that he's going to defend the Constitution, uphold the Constitution, faithfully execute the laws. What does that mean when this Supreme Court, in a decision, ruled that he could violate the laws with impunity? The Constitution, which I've carried with me for most of my legal career, it does not have any mention of presidential immunity. It has the opposite. The checks and balances of our Constitution are designed to keep the executive branch in check, the legislative branch in check, and the judiciary in check, and balanced in some form or another. This Constitution does not provide anywhere any support for the idea that a president is immune for criminal activity. In fact, it conveys the opposite. In the impeachment clause, it says that a president can be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors, which presumes that a president can commit crimes and be held accountable for them. In fact, during the second impeachment trial, at the end of that trial, when Mitch McConnell betrayed his initial reaction to that January 6th insurrection that resulted in the death of police officers and suicides and massive harm and an attack on our very system of government and the orderly transition of power, Mitch McConnell said, well, of course he could be held responsible in court, because no one besides President Nixon ever actually really believed or asserted that when a president does it, it's by definition lawful. That is an anathema to the American system of justice. It's an anathema to this Constitution. And this Constitution also conveys in two places for the executive the specific command that the job of the president is to faithfully execute the law. To faithfully execute the law twice. That's part of the oath, to faithfully execute the law, and nothing could be more faithless than breaking the law.
Stephen?
Oh, we're going to have a lot of fun. But I'm going to begin with some general comments first about how I size up the whole scene, because we're going to have plenty of time to get into all these things. It's great to be back in Boulder. This is, if you're a conservative, I call this an away game to come to Boulder, of course. On the other hand, I have been, for the last 8 years, an inmate at UC Berkeley in political science in the law school. And you guys are so much nicer than people in Berkeley are, I have to say. So I want to sort of start with the title of the panel, who really is in charge? And call us back to Alexander Hamilton's, or maybe it was Madison, dispute about this in the middle of the Federalist Papers, where he said a dependence on the people, no doubt, is the primary control in the government, but experience has taught us that auxiliary precautions are necessary. And what we're worried about now is that are these auxiliary precautions, what we call checks and balances, separation of powers, and other things, Bill of Rights, are they still working? Or are they not? Now, I have to say, I have a three-part opening thoughts on this. One is, I have to say, I'm always a little bemused when liberals discover separation of powers and checks and balances when a Republican is president, because, point one, the presidency we have today is the presidency liberals have wanted for more than a century. It was checks and balances and separation of powers that Woodrow Wilson, the premier scholar of the presidency 125 years ago, most disliked about our Constitution. And I invite you to go read some of his book on the presidency in 1908, and you'll see some, I think, pretty shocking things in there, including that a strong president should defy public opinion, contra Madison and Hamilton. He says in one point, I'll quote him here, I got a bunch of quotes, but I'm going to limit them, I don't have time. If Congress be overborne by the president, it will be no fault of the makers of the Constitution. And he also said that, if people don't get with the reform program of a president, well, they'll just be crushed. That was in his essay on Leaders of Men, which are quite shocking to read, or the thought experiment would be, take the words of Woodrow Wilson and put them in Donald Trump's mouth and see how you like them. Second point is, and by the way, another point that's important is that Wilson was also one of the primary theoreticians of the theories and structure of modern American public administration. Go to Franklin Roosevelt. We all remember that lapidary line in his first inaugural address, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. But read the last 3-4 paragraphs where he talks about how he wants to use bold executive power, which he says at one point, here, I'll quote it here, he says, where is it? It might call for a temporary departure from that normal balance of public procedure. His speechwriter, a forgotten guy now named Raymond Moley, who wrote the speech for him after long conversations about what Roosevelt wanted to say, wrote in his memoir later, I hesitated to take notes, for if some of these undeclared purposes should reach the opposition, there would be dangerous cries of dictatorship. And again, thought experiment. Read the last 4 paragraphs of Roosevelt's first inaugural address, put them in Donald Trump's mouth, and see how you like them. Now, the point 3 is, let's take the tariff thing that we're doing right now. So, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which I think most people rightly think made the Great Depression worse, was passed by Congress and signed by President Hoover, no doubt. But the question now is, as Trump is declaring these extraordinary, possibly worldwide economy-wrecking measures, I think it's quite possible that that's right, based on power delegated to him by Congress in the 1970s. Now, there is a challenge, and here's Lisa and I are going to have an extended argument about this, I think, of the major question doctrine and the delegation doctrine and so forth. But there is a challenge to it that has been filed by 2 conservative public interest groups saying that was an unconstitutional delegation of powers to the president. Congress could take it back, and I think they ought to. I think I'll say this. I disagree with Lisa that this is the worst constitutional crisis ever. I'd nominate the Civil War. And by the way, Lincoln got accused of violating the Constitution when he suspended the writ of habeas corpus on his own authority, even though that's a power mentioned in Article 1. But there's more to that story, of course, and we'll look forward to where we go from here. Thanks.
All right. Heather.
Thank you so much. I have to say, I think it is the most Colorado World Affairs Conference ever for experience to go from a panel on tariffs, where I was the sort of token expert on the panel, to this panel where I am definitely the token, oh boy, why am I on this panel? And I am very abashed, in particular, I am abashed by all of my fellow panelists, but I'm particularly abashed that I have to open my mouth before Ellen opens hers. So, with that throat clearing out of the way, when I looked at this panel and thought about how I was going to get up here and not embarrass myself too badly, I suspect I had the same reaction that most of you did that brought you here and that clearly animated both of our two initial speakers, that when we say checks and balances, we're referring to a very specific set of things in the Constitution. But I want to take a couple minutes to make the argument that actually it turns out, for better and worse, the most fundamental checks and balances in American society, like every other society the world has ever seen, by the way, are actually not the ones that are in the Constitution. But it turns out that the thing that makes our checks and balances either function or not function are much more in our relationship as the people and civil society institutions in various forms to the government. And I want to just very quickly tick through a couple of different examples of how I think that works. And the first one, and some of these, it's interesting because you can then say to me, oh no, but Heather, that is mentioned in the Constitution. So, an obvious easy one, for example, is that a free press, and indeed our wise founders foresaw, I'm thinking of Jefferson, if I had to choose between a free press and a government, I would choose, I'm not so sure, I wonder if Jefferson would look at what we have, the media landscape we have now, and he might change his mind, but nonetheless, the founders very clearly had an idea about what the role of what we now call the media was. And I'll just gently suggest that our weird world of bubbles and media deserts may mean that we actually can't have a media that operates as a check and balance in the way that, either the way that the founders intended, nor are we able to update how the heck an electronic media is supposed to act as a check and balance on an AI-enabled government. I don't know what the answer is to that, but I just will flag that as a problem. My second point, also mentioned in the Constitution, but something we never think about when we think about checks and balances, is the role of the military. And the military provides a couple of really vital checks and balances, if you think about it. One of them, which really comes in handy when it works, is that it's supposed to have a monopoly on lethal force. So that the fact that the military is sitting there means that you are not menaced by random militias that are not related to the government and not given their weapons by the government. Now, one can argue that already, I live right near Washington, D.C., and we worry a lot about the Proud Boys showing up. Folks who live in the West, I know you have some other concerns with militias. So already, we face this interesting problem of is our military, despite being the world's largest, most advanced, best funded, actually performing that function for us? The second check that our military is supposed to perform is a negative one. That is, it is not supposed to be involved in our politics or in our domestic law enforcement. And we've been eating away slowly at the edges of that over the years: war on drugs, immigration, terrorism. But we're now eating away potentially very rapidly at that in some of the changes you see being made or changes you see being proposed that will basically put us in a permanent state of emergency, make every bad thing that happens outside our borders a war that we're in. You didn't know that fentanyl was a war. You didn't know that we were at war with Tren de Aragua. You didn't know that we were at war. I could go on. But this poses, and we can talk more about this too, a very serious set of questions around how is the exercise of force in our society being checked and managed, and what ability does a president have to use force as opposed to the ability we think or want a president to have to use force. And my last point, which kind of flows from what I said earlier, is that civil society, us, we are supposed to be the ultimate check and balance, but we're not supposed to do that as or it doesn't work all that well when we do it as little atomized institutions. We're supposed to be able to do it through institutions. Institutions like universities, institutions like law firms, institutions like houses of worship. And so I ask you to sit and think how you feel about the health of your civil society institutions that can serve as a check on executive power, and why you think they are not perhaps as healthy as they ought to be. And I'll stop there.
Ellen.
So, funny story. I was invited to this conference a number of months ago when I was still sitting in my office at the FEC with the commissioner on the door. And before I was elected chair for the commission for the year 2025. But about a month into the year and less than 3 weeks into this administration, I got this letter that claimed that I was being removed from that position. So in terms of the title of this panel, who is really in charge? I guess not me. But and I wrote to the folks who invited me, and I said, "Hey, I know you invited a commissioner, and it looks like I'm not actually a commissioner anymore. So if you want to, revoke the invitation, no hard feelings." And they said, "Oh no, we want you to come and be on another panel, particularly on checks and balances." So. This was part of, obviously I'm not the only person who's been fired lately in Washington, and if you're watching the lawsuit that a couple of other fired commissioners have filed, they were fired, they were, I think the first decision reinstated them, then it was appealed to a panel of the DC Circuit Court that unreinstated them, and that was appealed to the full panel, the entire DC Circuit Court, which reinstated them. And as of, I think, today, John Roberts has reinstated them while the suit is going forward. So it's really quite a ping pong ball. And this is all part of a very systematic attempt to remove from government any opposition voices. And I think that is very dangerous for government to not have opposition voices. Thank you. However, it turns out that just because one is removed from a government office and loses one's government email address does not mean that one loses one's voice. And I think that that is another really important check and balance that really all of us have, but I try to do what I can. So when the FEC was sued this year, and I wasn't entirely sure how vigorously my former colleagues were going to defend the agency, I decided to file an amicus brief to raise issues that I thought were important about the importance of preserving the independence of the FEC as a bipartisan body that's supposed to make decisions on a bipartisan basis and not just take orders from the president. That's not the way it was set up. What I was afraid of actually has gotten worse since I left, because then the president, after issuing an executive order affecting all independent agencies, specifically went after a really obscure agency that maybe some of you haven't even heard of, called the Election Assistance Commission. This is a tiny commission, also supposed to work on a bipartisan basis. One of the things it does is it puts out standards for certifying voting machines, hands out grant money to individual states and localities to help them run good elections. And according to the terms of this new executive order, the president basically started dictating to the EAC how they were supposed to hand out money, who was supposed to get it, who wasn't supposed to get it, what they would have to do in order to get it, changing voter registration requirements. And if you go back to the Constitution again, there is a clause on elections. It says the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations, except as to the places of choosing senators. So, one noun that you didn't hear in that clause was the president, right? He doesn't actually have a role in any of that. So there are multiple folks who sued on that executive order, and I am very hopeful that they will have some success in that litigation. These attacks on independent agencies, on the press, on lawyers, on the ABA today, coming from the Deputy Attorney General, all of these are attacks on checks and balances on the executive. And there's been a lot of discussion. The one image that keeps coming up at this conference is the image of the pendulum. And people say, oh, the pendulum is going to swing back. Well, if you think about a pendulum, imagine I'm holding a string and there's a little ball on it. It's not just unidirectional, right? It could go in any number of different directions. And it's not going to happen on its own. So what the ultimate check and balance is all of us using our voice and our power to push that pendulum and get it going back in the right direction.
I'm going to open the discussion now to our panelists and invite them to respond to each other.
I have some responses. All right, I just want to say, please do not associate me with Woodrow Wilson. He was a racist who premiered Birth of a Nation at the White House. He pushed through a draft for World War I and had people arrested for talking to other people about burning their draft cards, about not being forced into that war. And in a terrible U.S. Supreme Court decision called U.S. v. Schenck, they basically allowed this repressive regime that Woodrow Wilson had imposed to be upheld. So I'm saying no to Woodrow Wilson. Now, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Progress on the learning curve. Oh, sorry.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that first address is a really important and powerful address. But if you look at what happened with Congress, was that with the initiative of people like Francis Perkins, who took the idea of Social Security into a reality through legislation. The New Deal was largely moved through legislation with the consent of Congress. There was a period in which the U.S. Supreme Court was in this activist, repressive mode. It had been in this mode for a couple of decades. It had been striking down legislation based on its view that a contract was supreme, and that all these things, any rules about labor, rules about safety in the workplace or wages, were somehow an infringement on some inherent golden right to contract. Roosevelt was ticked off about this. He threatened to expand the court. This was seen as illegitimate. And then ultimately there was a change in the perspective of the Supreme Court, and they ended up approving a number of these pieces of legislation, which really built the foundation of our civil society in the 20th century. The idea that we have obligations to one another. The idea that the preamble of the Constitution, which many right-wingers routinely disregard, actually, has some meaning, even though it's not just hortatory. It says, sorry, I'm going to grab it here. It says that we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish the Constitution. So there is a dispute in the historical world about Franklin Delano Roosevelt and what he did and what he said. What FDR did in terms of advancing that New Deal, those tremendous advances for our commitment to one another as Americans, the efforts to deal with the Great Depression and the enormous poverty that the American people were facing, I think those were worthy and important advances that have helped actually make America great, like Social Security. So I'm going to take the FDR. Okay.
Well,
wait, I've got two more things, just quickly. Okay. Two more things. I'm going to leave Smoot. I'm going to leave the tariffs to you get Smoot. But let me just say, I take your point that the Civil War was worse. So let me just say, other than a civil war, this is the biggest constitutional crisis we faced. So I'll stop there and hand it over to my colleague.
Well, just one quick point, if I can. So he's responding mostly to me. So first of all, the point about Wilson is not what an ugly person he was, it's what was his theory, and did his understanding of the Constitution take hold? My first challenge to you is this: if you stripped away all the ugliness of Wilson, which I heartily agree with, I would find a hard time distinguishing your outlook on the Constitution from his. But more important on Roosevelt. Now here I'm really going to surprise you and probably most of the room. I'm one of the oddball conservatives that likes FDR. And now it's possible to say that here I'm with Conrad Black, the great Canadian author, that he's a defender of freedom. At the same time, I can say there's lots of parts of the New Deal I think were dumb and counterproductive. But you take him as a whole, we arrive at a similar place. I wouldn't use your bullet points, but on this point about his disposition, so here's a parallel. Just mention one and then stop. I could do a lot on this, obviously. I'm academic. But his first week in office, what's the big, bold step he took as an executive? The bank holiday. Close all the banks in the country. Probably a good idea to prevent a panic. However, what was the legal authority for that? Yeah. Anyone know? You know? No, it was the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, a World War I measure. Who was the enemy in 1933? Who'd you say?
Fear itself.
Oh, fear. Oh, that's true. Okay, I thought you were going to say I thought you were going to say Sam Insull or some of the business people he took after, But look, there was a jurisdictional problem, which is how do you reach state banks? We didn't have any of the federal agencies yet that could give federal jurisdiction over, say, the First State Bank of Duluth. So they can Trading with the Enemy Act? That sounds to me about as, and by the way, no one thought to challenge it, but I think a court today would say, you must be kidding. But there's an example of extending an old statute. The parallel, I think, ought to be obvious. The Alien Enemies Act from 1798, which I thought had been repealed in 1801. I guess not. I missed that one. But anyway, so there's the point, is that what we're seeing now in the form of presidential power is not unprecedented. If you don't like what he's doing, that's fine. We can have all those arguments all day long, and no doubt would in this room.
So I'm actually going to lean right in there because I do think, there are a couple of people who are getting left out of this presidential power conversation. One of them, of course, is Abraham Lincoln, that every Democrat's favorite Republican, right? Who, among many other things, imposed martial law in my home state of Maryland in order to prevent it from seceding and joining the Confederacy. Yeah. Definitely not okay. Not what the Constitution had in mind. And then, of course, we could also, I'll just briefly mention Richard Nixon. But the chief reason that I'm actually going to mention Nixon here is to indulge in a little nostalgia. And that is that I think one of the things that really concerns me about the present moment, as opposed to Lincoln, Wilson, Roosevelt, and even Nixon, is that really noteworthily, none of them set out with a comprehensive plan to silence or disempower the civil society institutions that could push back against what he was doing. And my Nixon nostalgia, for folks in the room who remember this, is that who were some of the first folks to stand up and say, actually, this is illegal and it's going to go, this business of going after larger societal forces? It was Richard Nixon's fellow Republicans. And that is a thing that makes this moment, and coupling the playing fast and loose with constitutional authorities and executive power, which, Steve, again, I would actually go even further than you here, and I would make a slightly different argument, which leaves Wilson out of it, so it lets us, we can drop him as a personality. But I'm very convinced, and folks may have heard me say this yesterday, by the case that as the U.S. has built up a larger and larger security establishment, that has brought with it a larger and larger centralizing of power around the executive and away from the legislature, in part because who controls the lethal forces? The executive. Who wants responsibility for the lethal forces? Not the legislature. So and this is where I will just glancingly mention Smoot-Hawley, because nobody wants to talk about Smoot-Hawley, really. But it's interesting, right? Because that's something that we all regard as a catastrophe. Well, no, not all of us. There are some of us, I guess, who are defending. It's trendy to defend them now. But that was the legislature responding to political imperatives and then it paid the price for that. Whereas the reason that successive Congresses, Republican and Democratic, have been like, who us? Control the trade policy? Tell the White House no? Or even more, who us? Move forward affirmatively on a trade policy, has been a desire not to take responsibility. And that's a way that our politics, it's an interesting way that the lack of responsibility is by itself an abrogation of checks and balances.
That's not further than me, I'll just say it.
I was trying.
All right, I'm going to bring up another favorite Republican president, Teddy Roosevelt, because Teddy Roosevelt was, despite the fact that he was elected with the support of a lot of very wealthy people who thought that he was going to be their guy, when he got into office, he said, you know what, all this big money in politics is really a very bad thing for the country. And unfortunately, we have, the Supreme Court has taken us a long way back from his original principles. But again, going back to the check and the balance of the power of the people, if you look at what happened in the Wisconsin judicial race, where Elon Musk, I mean, we are in this insane situation where the richest man in the world, and also the owner of a major social media platform from which a lot of folks get their information, is really kind of a devastating combination, has gone all in on trying to influence elections. But it turns out that money isn't everything. And the good people of Wisconsin, saw that he was basically trying to buy a judicial seat on their Supreme Court, and they said, hell no. So again, you know, it is a bad thing, I would say, as someone who has been in the business of regulating money in politics, that these billionaires have the ability to spend as much as they can to try and get the government that they want. But it is money doesn't get you all the way there, and we still have the power to decide who ultimately gets elected.
I have a quick two questions, or well, you can respond in turn or in time. If I understand Lisa's argument correctly, she's saying that we are in a constitutional crisis because of the Supreme Court ruling that enabled the second term of Donald Trump. So are you saying, given the theme of this panel session, that the Supreme Court is really in charge? Are you saying judicial power is the ultimate power? Secondly, yeah, actually, let's just start there.
Okay. You know, there's been a lot of hand-wringing about, are we in a constitutional crisis? When would we be in a constitutional crisis? When do we break glass? Someone says, like, that it is a crisis. I think the crisis really began last summer with that decision, because it really is, it's unmoored from the text of the Constitution. It has created a situation in which you have a person who, maybe he's read the First Amendment, I don't know. I'm pretty sure he hasn't read the whole Constitution. He believes that he now has the permission from this court to do almost anything. And he has come into this administration with a series of acts that are, as Heather said, unprecedented in terms of the attacks on civil society. The use of the power of the presidency to threaten and bully individuals because of their views. The idea that he would, separately, pardon people who were convicted of violent acts, while then basically directing his immigration services to pick up students who wrote an op-ed in the paper about, foreign policy. These are really extraordinary times, and so I don't think the court is the most powerful institution at present. I think the court, under John Roberts, basically paved the way for Trump's return and created the conditions for the lawlessness that we're seeing now. And even in the past 24 hours, we've seen this court, the Roberts Court, issue orders that undo orders of lower courts that were trying to hold the status quo, trying to protect the normal rule of law, and instead allow these policies to go forward, give license, and then wait for another day perhaps to stop them, or perhaps not. But the reason why I don't think it's the most powerful institution is because J.D. Vance expressly said previously, he invoked Andrew Jackson, President Jackson in his series of lawless acts, in my view. But he invoked Andrew Jackson in basically saying, let the Supreme Court enforce its orders, because the Supreme Court does not have an army at its stead. It doesn't have police. It has the U.S. Marshal Service, which reports, in essence, structurally to the Justice Department. It's within the Justice Department. And so we will soon see if the Roberts Court decides to say no to something, and if Trump refuses to follow those rules at the behest of his Ivy League educated vice president, we will see what happens next. And as some of you may have heard, I have a book that's about some of these things. It's called Without Precedent. It's about John Roberts and his assault on voting rights, his assault on other rights that we hold dear, and how he helped pave the way for the crisis that we're in the middle of.
Responses?
Go ahead. You go first.
All right, you go first.
You want me? All right. I don't want. I mean,
He doesn't want to pick on me.
I don't, right? Just a couple of points of dissent and not draw it out, because it takes me 2 full days when I teach the presidency to talk about why it's. See, here's what I should state my disagreement. I don't agree that the text of the Constitution doesn't have any implication or any consideration of some degree of presidential immunity. And the way I usually start doing this with a class is to say, notice the difference between how Article 1 begins and Article 2 begins. Article 1 says, all legislative powers herein granted, meaning there's a limited number, and that's, Article 1, Section 8. Article 2 begins, the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States. Now, this wasn't invented out of whole cloth, and this gives us the theory of the unitary executive, which is one little small part of that's been a live issue since George W. Bush, if not before. Look, this draws upon the problem of how you're going to have an executive that's not a monarch who enjoys sovereign immunity because we believe in the divine right of kings and other crazy things. But it is connected to the idea of sovereign immunity and why it is difficult, and we put barriers to suing the government. It takes a while to explain all that. But one example, then I'll shut up. Thomas Jefferson thought his acquisition of Louisiana was unconstitutional because Congress hadn't appropriated the money, and he justified it by saying there's this huge opportunity for national. He gave all the reasons why it's a great idea to acquire Louisiana from France, and Congress was out of session. I got to move. I got to do things similar to Lincoln's justification for suspending habeas corpus. And in justifying that, in some letters he wrote, he drew upon John Locke's theories of prerogative in the Second Treatise, which was so influential for our Declaration of Independence. Now, I think here, at least you and I are going to disagree about this. I thought the Supreme Court argument on this question was very serious, very sophisticated, reflected doubts and difficulties with the problem. And I'll stipulate this to you. Yes, I worry about someone of Donald Trump who thinks there's 13 articles of the Constitution. Might go too far with it. I'll give you that much. But I don't think the court was wrong in its fundamental determination in that case.
So there we disagree.
Of course. That's why we're here.
Yes.
So, are we in a constitutional crisis? Maybe is the wrong question. I know there are some legal scholars who say, well, we will be in a constitutional crisis if the Supreme Court hands down a ruling and the president says, never mind, that's nice, glad you have your opinion, but that's, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. But there's a lot of things that could happen short of that would still be bad, because I think that one of the motivations here that seems to be coming from the administration is the attempt to intimidate and to cause people. This is the problem that Timothy Snyder talks about of obeying in advance. So, my concern is the Supreme Court. I mean, putting aside the fact that, I don't have a majority from my point of view on the Supreme Court. It's kind of stacked against people who think the way I do in constitutional terms. But putting that aside, will this Supreme Court want to tee up that risk of having the president say, "Oh, you're not going to let me do what I want to do? Well, I'm going to do it anyway." Will the Supreme Court try to avoid that by coming up with very modest and not very bold opinions to push back against assertions of extra presidential powers. And I worry about that as much as anything else, because I can see this throughout government. You know, one of the things that happened when I got fired was that this was a shot against the bow that other people in government would understand as, oh, if that person could get fired for being kind of a loudmouth and saying things like, no, there wasn't voter fraud in the 2020 election. And actually, it's not a good thing to be asking foreign governments for assistance in elections, and, you know, whatever else I might have said along the way that might have, you know, been deemed unfriendly. You know, what are other folks going to be doing when they are coming up with rulings, when they are considering issues that would affect this administration? Are they going to feel empowered to take bold positions? And, you know, I think we're seeing some of that in the judiciary at the lower levels. I mean, I was glad to see that a Trump-appointed district court judge in D.C. pushed back very hard on the choice to try and remove the AP from the press pool. So, you know, that was good. I was pleased to see that, and there have been some good decisions, but I do worry about whether the Supreme Court will try to avoid a constitutional crisis by just going along with things that maybe they shouldn't go along with.
Speaking of worry, based on the questions, I'm sensing there's a lot of fear in the audience. Fear in particular of Trump perhaps seeking a third term. Are there constitutional checks against Trump seeking a third term? Yeah. Do you want to comment briefly on what those are, just to allay at least one of the fears?
Well, it would be in direct violation of the Constitution, but that is not necessarily an inhibitor. And you know, he has allies who are pushing this idea that it only applies to consecutive terms, not non-consecutive terms, the two-term limit. I think these are bogus arguments. I think the technical term is they're bullshit. But he is in the White House. He is the president. He has previously been urged to seize voting machines. That was what you know, one of his close advisors was suggesting in 2020. He has issued this declaration in defiance of the way the Constitution describes how voting rights are organized, to basically suggest that for the 2026 election, and if I get this wrong, Ellen, please correct me, but in essence, my understanding of this order is that you have to re-demonstrate or demonstrate anew, in essence, that you are a U.S. citizen and re-register to vote before the 2026 election. And if not, they will punish your state or perhaps not recognize your election or not recognize the election. There's a whole array of things that they're threatening or that he's menacing. And that's just the 2026 election. That's not at 2028. And so in a normal environment, no person who was president would suggest that they are entitled to a third term in defiance of the amendment that expressly bars it. But we're not in normal times. I don't think that it will happen because there's a lot of mileage between here and there. And also, I would just say, as I said previously on a panel, the thing about this assault, this menacing, this threatening, this aggression, is it's designed to make you fear. It's designed to paralyze you with fear and make you worry. And worry is the enemy of progress. Worry, as I said to many of my friends, worry is a thief. It inhibits your ability to concentrate on what you can do right now, today, to make a difference. It robs you of joy. And boy, do we need to grasp joy in the midst of crises like this. And hope is a tremendous fuel for change. And as Heather was saying, and Ellen was saying, civil society, like our power, this 300 million plus society, you know, has the power to say, no, we didn't agree to this. No, we don't accept this. We're gonna speak out. We're gonna throw sand in the gears through litigation. We're gonna throw sand in the gears through resistance, standing up, nonviolently speaking out. We have a lot of miles between here and the future is not set yet. That is not set. It is a desire, a whim, a threat, but it is not real, and we can ensure that it is not real, in my opinion.
I agree with all of that, and I do not think, I don't believe that he's going to run for a third term because it is so plain and black and white in the Constitution that he's not allowed to do that. But I do worry more about mucking around with the mechanics of election administration. I think that is a serious concern, and I think that I want to echo what Lisa said and what another panelist said on an earlier program. Take the anxiety, take that energy, and transform it into positive action. Make sure that you're paying attention to what is going on in your state and in your locality, which is where elections are administered. And make sure that bad things are not happening and that you are taking affirmative steps. Come up with an affirmative thing to do every day or every week, whatever you have the energy to do, to try and ensure that the bad things don't happen in the next election, because these decisions will be made in very local places at the state and local level. And you probably have more influence with your state officials, with your county officials, than you would with the President of the United States, because these are people in your community that you can reach.
Well, if you all are both going to be optimistic, I'm going to come along and bum us out and then let Steve respond to all of us. And I want to actually combine the last two questions a little bit and sort of interrogate this question of, are we in a crisis? What is a crisis? And I think it's really interesting to actually go back to the various historical examples that we cited. And I think, Lincoln would have said to you, well, there's a large crisis here, and that's why I'm suspending habeas and imposing martial law. Roosevelt, obviously, the banks was the response to a felt and experienced economic crisis. And a really interesting thing about this moment that we're in is that lots of good card-carrying liberals like myself are going around, as Ellen said, either saying we are already in a constitutional crisis, as Lisa said, or debating, when is the constitutional crisis. But we are all sort of running around constitutional crisis. President Trump, meanwhile, is invoking a variety of laws that you basically had forgotten. I mean, the 1798 one is the most extreme, all of which are saying that we are in some kind of crisis that many of us, had no idea that we were in, but that at least some of his voters are very responsive to the idea that we are in a crisis that rises to the level of the Great Depression or the Civil War or World War II. So that is just to say, first of all, unfortunately, this crisis is in the eye of the beholder. There's not a constitutional definition of it, and even if there were, we wouldn't agree on it anymore. And that also brings me to a concern that I have about 2028, which grows both out of some of the factors I mentioned earlier and an observation of other societies and what would-be autocrats do in other societies. One question is, does the president run? A second question is there an election? And what are the circumstances under which one could imagine there being a claim of a crisis that would allow for the argument that we didn't need to have an election or couldn't have an election? And I raise that and I agree with everything Lisa and Ellen said. This isn't inevitable. There's lots you can do. There's lots we should all be doing. But if you look at history and politics in other countries of how elected autocrats install themselves to stay in power, you'd be a fool not to be worried about that one.
More questions?
Yeah.
Someone in the audience wants to hear a steelman case for Donald Trump's actions. Let me put the question like this. Even those on the left might agree that the growth of the administrative state since, let's say, the end of the Cold War has in some ways limited the efficacy of the Constitution. Could you make the case that Trump's actions are, in some sense, an effort to restore constitutional authority?
All right, well, I'm game. Let's take Ellen's firing action as a good example, I think. This was a power that Franklin Roosevelt wanted, right? He fired the chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, And he appealed to the Supreme Court and said, no, Mr. President, you can't fire him. And I think this is very deliberate to try and tee up a reconsideration of that case. And the reasoning of that case was, today I think is thought to be doubtful. It was, well, the Federal Trade Commission, it's quasi-legislative and it's quasi-executive, and so it has partly congressional types of powers, and so therefore it's really beyond independence. It's, the FEC is an independent commission. Although, I don't know if we want to talk about this or not, the most unusual one, there's no other commission like it in American government ever, in that it has 6 members instead of 5. That we could talk about, interestingly, I think, for a long time. Anyway, we're teeing up with that because there's been a lot of reconsideration about whether that Humphrey's executor in 1934 was correctly decided. I'll just mention that a lot of this rethinking has gone back to the independent counsel, which the Supreme Court upheld in 1987 or 88 by an 8-1 vote. And now even Linda Greenhouse of the New York Times says, Scalia's dissent was right. That the independent counsel was a bad idea because who's this person accountable to? They set their own budget. They're no longer accountable to either Congress or the president or the attorney general. And the same logic, I think, is now being extended. Now, there's a second step to this that's a whole new kettle of fish, which is, can the president then control the civil service and permanent employees of the federal government? And that brings up the old Pendleton Act. Lots of thoughts on that. But for now, the president is deliberately using Ellen and others on commissions to try and tee up expanding presidential power to actually control the executive branch more directly.
You want to respond, and then I'll...
Oh, bad.
Well,
I'm going to get piled on now. But okay.
No, it's fine. No, I mean, I actually agree with a lot of what you just said, because I think this plainly was a deliberate attempt to tee up a challenge to this 90-year-old precedent called Humphrey's executor. It's Humphrey's executor because Humphrey was the FTC commissioner who was fired, and he died before the case could go to trial, and so his executor was trying to get back pay. And my husband is very eager that there be no case for Weintraub's executor. We're gonna try and at least live through the administration. As I said at the beginning, I think opposition voices in government are important, and the FEC is an unusual entity because it regulates the very people who get to select who is a commissioner and get to confirm who is a commissioner. Most agencies don't do that, and there was a very deliberate decision made by Congress in the wake of Watergate when everybody was up in arms, but they were still a little bit nervous about having an agency that would regulate them, and they set it up this way on purpose. And I have to say, we had 6 commissioners, no more than 3 from any one political party, and the EAC, the agency I was talking about earlier, is similarly bipartisan, 2 and 2. And right now, I was fired, and a Republican commissioner had resigned on January 20th in order to become counsel to J.D. Vance. So they're down to 2 and 2 now, which is a bare quorum. They can function unless somebody else leaves or gets fired, in which case they won't be functional anymore. But, Congress did that on purpose because they did not want partisan control. They did not want one party to be able to use the mechanism of the FEC in order to financially penalize the opposing party. They didn't want their resources to be tapped by a series of complaints that the FEC would then try and settle by exacting penalties from one party and only one party. And let me tell you, a bipartisan agency isn't always that effective. I mean, there are plenty of times, you can go to my old webpage, still on the website, has, probably thousands of statements that I've written about cases that I thought we should have done more on, and we didn't. So it's not always effective, but that bipartisanship is really important when you are, in fact, regulating politics. I think that, you want to talk about government writ large and whether it is bloated? Probably. But does that mean you want to take a chainsaw to entire agencies? I would argue no. because if you are used to running private companies and you're willing to destroy your private company and then say, well, we can always build back later, that's one decision. But when we're talking about government agencies that provide, let's say, Social Security checks, which 40% of elderly people rely on to survive, maybe taking a chainsaw to that agency and risking having the whole thing collapse and, oh, you think you can fix it later, maybe that's not such a great idea. So there was the reinventing government in the Clinton administration. Other administrations have tried to pare back government. I'm not going to say that government couldn't use some streamlining, but I don't think it should be done with a chainsaw.
I just can't give any credit to the idea that this is about trimming back the administrative state when Donald Trump just proposed a 25% increase in the Pentagon budget to $1 trillion. If you want to start somewhere with graft and waste and over expenditures and a question of what should be our public policy, what are our choices about how we spend money, that would be, the Pentagon and that spending would be an area where you would, if you actually cared about the power of government, you might want to actually realign our policies and not seek an expansion, a massive expansion to $1 trillion because it just is a good sounding number to the dude in the White House. That is utterly inconsistent with this notion that they really care about the administrative state. Now, the administrative state is a fancy term that the right wing has really advanced as a way to alienate you from your government, from our government, from Social Security, from the Veterans Affairs Department, from the Education Department, from NOAA and studying climate and all these things that we rely on in our society. The fact is that this, quote, administrative state is the state that our Congress has fully funded year after year to advance our interests, to advance the public interest, to investigate disease, to make sure that we have the best opportunities for vaccines or cancer prevention or cancer cures. These are vital programs that have been under assault by this sort of attack on the mythological administrative state that is supposedly doing you harm. There's a group that Stephen referenced but didn't name called the New Civil Liberties Alliance, which has spoken up about this question of non-delegation and major questions over trade. That's a group that is predominantly funded by Charles Koch, one of the richest billionaires in the world. He staked the group. NCLA is led by a professor named Philip Hamburger, who said the administrative state is the greatest threat to liberty in history. I have other things that are actually a greater threat to liberty in history than the fact that we have a Social Security agency and an IRS that was actually starting to go after auditing billionaires, or that we have a VA hospital system that was sort of broken but was expanded to deal with the number of veterans who need care. But they have invested huge sums. Leonard Leo, who is the guy who helped pack the U.S. Supreme Court, handpicked the people who Trump chose from. He now has $1 billion at his disposal, and one of his main targets is the administrative state. They created a whole center at George Mason University, put this other right-winger named C. Boyd and Gray in charge of it. It was the Center for the Study of the Administrative State. They've fueled cases to come to the Supreme Court to attack the administrative state, to take down precedents like the Chevron doctrine that required deference from judges to the expertise of federal agencies in things like science or vaccines or mifepristone, access to medicine through the FDA. This attack on the administrative state, as Nancy MacLean described in her book, Democracy in Chains, is about trying to enchain our democracy. It's trying to enchain the government that largely, with the civil servants who've been ruthlessly fired, despite their devotion to our interests, to serving our government, this is an effort to basically limit the power of our government to provide services that we want and that we need. And if Congress wanted to not fund those agencies, it could. And that could be signed into law by the president tomorrow. And that may well happen. There are cuts that are coming. But the fact is that enchaining democracy hurts us all. And you know who gains when democracy is enchained? The most powerful people and corporations on the planet in our society. When government is not constraining them from polluting our rivers, when government is not constraining them from poisoning battery workers at a factory, they maximize their profits at our expense. We need these agencies to protect our public interest, our public health, and our future.
Here's the
Lisa manages to pack in a lot. So I just want to make two quick points. One is, I have to contest a bit. The administrative state is a sort of a right-wing boogeyman. It's not of recent origin. The first book noting that this was a different kind of government was written by a Yale professor in 1948, Dwight Waldo. There were serious critiques of it in the 1960s from Vincent Ostrom at the University of Indiana. It's not brand new. And Philip Hamburger, I know Phil pretty well. There's serious work on this. His book, Is Administrative Law Unlawful? It's 600 pages of densely argued work. So, yes, I won't contest Lisa's bringing to our attention and disliking the political machinations of this, of Leonard Lee and all the others. Second point, I won't develop this, but I just want to plan it with Lisa. For those of you who know anything about the Chevron doctrine, it's been made the news. That was a case that in 1984 that the Reagan administration won.
Yeah.
That was a case that conservatives celebrated. So how did this get all turned around? I'll stop there and say that's what I've taught a whole class about at Berkeley Law. No, the world's just a little more complicated sometimes than Lisa or me make out.
Let me just say, I'm saying that the boogeyman of it has really been invested in by these very powerful forces who've spent millions in recent years in order to take advantage of this packed Supreme Court to reverse decades of legal precedent.
Yeah, here's where I think we'd actually have some harmony, which is what a weird phrase. Right? It was an obscure term of political scientists, and now it has burst out into ordinary discourse, which is kind of amazing. I guess my right wing will take that as a win.
I'm getting the signal, guys. I think we've got to wrap this up. Thank you so much to our panelists and to you.